Lately, the internet has been arguing about pubic hair again. Bush or no bush, full Brazilian or natural, clean girl maintenance versus body hair rebellion. And what fascinates me is not that people have preferences, it's how emotionally charged the conversation becomes. Because female body hair is not treated like neutral biology, it's treated like a statement. Lazy, dirty, empowered, gross, confident, letting yourself go, feminist, unfeminine. Somehow, a patch of hair growing naturally from the adult female body has become loaded with morality, desirability, discipline, politics, and shame. And that alone should make us pause. Because pubic hair is not a modern invention. Women did not collectively wake up one day and suddenly decide adult female body hair was disgusting. So, where did that disgust come from? Why are women expected to remove visible signs of adulthood from their bodies while men are allowed to look unmistakably adult? And why does patriarchy reward women for appearing increasingly hairless, smooth, youthful, and controlled in the first place? Because once you start pulling at the thread of female body hair politics, you realize this conversation was never just about grooming. Let's get into it. The thing about beauty standards is that they rarely arrive looking violent. They arrive looking normal, routine, feminine, expected, just hygiene, just preference, just maintenance. And few beauty standards have become more normalized than female hair removal. Women shave their legs, their underarms, their bikini lines, their pubic hair. Not occasionally, constantly. And what's fascinating is how rarely we stop to ask why. Because body hair is not a disease. It is not evidence that the body has failed. It is not abnormal. Pubic hair is a secondary sex characteristic. It appears during puberty. It is one of the biological markers of physical adulthood. And yet, patriarchy increasingly treats visible female body hair as something embarrassing, dirty, unfeminine, undesirable, or socially unacceptable. Meanwhile, male body hair is often framed as rugged, masculine, mature, sexual, natural. That contradiction matters. A lot. Because this episode is not really about shaving. It's about what patriarchy demands female bodies look like. Hairless, controlled, disciplined, youthful, refined, permanently maintained. And once you start looking closely at the history of body hair removal, you realize something deeply unsettling. Patriarchy does not simply ask women to be attractive, it asks women to perform bodily control. So today, we're digging into the history of pubic hair, the rise of beauty labor, the influence of capitalism and pornography, the racial politics of clean femininity, and why disgust toward female body hair may be far more socially conditioned than most people realize. Because maybe the real question isn't, why do women remove body hair? Maybe the real question is, who taught women that adulthood on the female body needed to disappear in the first place? One of the biggest myths surrounding female body hair is the idea that women have always removed it, and that's not entirely true. Now, hair removal absolutely existed throughout history, but the way it functioned culturally was very different from the system modern women live under now. Because historically, hair removal was often ritualistic, class based, occasional, religious, aesthetic, practical. What it usually was not was a nonstop psychological obligation tied to a woman's social worth. That distinction matters enormously. Let's start with ancient Egypt, because this is one of the earliest cultures people point to when discussing female hair removal. Ancient Egyptian elites, both women and men, removed body hair using sugaring pastes, tweezers, pumice stones, and early waxing methods. Smoothness was associated with cleanliness, refinement, status, and elite presentation. In hot climates, hair removal could also have practical and hygienic dimensions. Egyptologist Joyce Tildesley notes that elite grooming in ancient Egypt was deeply tied to status presentation and bodily discipline. And importantly, body modification in Egypt was not uniquely imposed on women. Elite men also participated heavily in grooming rituals. That's important because modern body hair politics are profoundly gendered in ways many earlier grooming traditions were not. Then we move into ancient Greece and Rome. The Greeks were deeply invested in beauty, symmetry, refinement, and bodily aesthetics. Upper class women sometimes removed pubic hair using tweezers or primitive depilatory pastes. Roman poet Ovid even references female grooming practices in Ars Amatoria, warning women against visible body hair in explicitly aesthetic terms. But again, these practices were largely tied to elite femininity and refinement, not universal social panic. There is a huge difference between some upper class women groom body hair and women are socially punished for failing to remain hairless at all times. Those are not the same cultural conditions. And honestly, for most of history, female body hair was simply not subjected to the kind of hypervisibility modern women experience today. Why? Because the body itself was less publicly surveyed. In medieval Europe, for example, women's bodies were largely concealed beneath layers of clothing. Hair removal existed in some contexts, particularly around the hairline, forehead, and eyebrows during certain beauty trends, but widespread obsession with visible body hair was far less culturally dominant than it would later become. Historian Kathy Pice notes that beauty rituals historically fluctuated according to visibility, class, fashion, and changing social norms. And then there are Islamic grooming traditions, which are often completely erased from Western conversations about body hair. Islamic hygienic traditions have long included recommendations surrounding pubic and underarm hair maintenance tied to ritual cleanliness practices. But again, the framework was different from modern capitalist beauty culture. The point here is not women never removed hair before feminism. That's ahistorical nonsense. The point is this: hair removal existed historically, but it had not yet become industrialized feminine surveillance. Women were not yet expected to exist in a permanent state of bodily maintenance under the gaze of advertising, pornography, social media, celebrity culture, and consumer capitalism. That comes later, and when it arrives, it changes everything. If we want to understand why female body hair suddenly became a cultural emergency, we need to talk about capitalism. Because modern beauty culture does not simply sell products, it manufactures insecurities. And one of the clearest examples of that is the razor industry. By the early 1900s, companies like Gillette had a problem. They had largely saturated the male razor market. Most adult men who wanted razors already owned them. So corporations went looking for a new consumer base: women. And at almost the exact same moment, fashion starts changing. Sleeveless dresses become fashionable, hemlines rise, more skin becomes publicly visible. And suddenly, advertisers realize they can turn female body hair into a profitable problem. In 1915, Gillette launched one of the first major razor campaigns targeting women, advertising the Milady Décolleté razor. And the language these ads used is fascinating. They did not merely suggest shaving, they framed visible female body hair as embarrassing, unfeminine, unsanitary, socially humiliating. Historian Rebecca Hersig, author of Plucked, A History of Hair Removal, explains that modern hair removal industries transformed hair into a problem requiring constant management. That line is important: constant management, because this is where the female body starts becoming a permanent maintenance project. Naomi Wolf talks about this brilliantly in The Beauty Myth when she argues that beauty culture functions as a form of labor. And honestly, think about how much unpaid labor women perform simply to remain socially acceptable. Shaving, waxing, tweezing, laser appointments, skincare, hair care, makeup, nails, dieting, fitness, anti aging maintenance. Femininity under patriarchy is extraordinarily time consuming. And much of that labor becomes so normalized that women stop seeing it as labor at all. It just becomes getting ready, self care, maintenance. But maintenance for whom? Because men are generally not expected to spend comparable amounts of time removing natural evidence of adulthood from their bodies. And this is where beauty culture becomes psychologically powerful. The standard no longer feels imposed. It starts feeling natural, normal, expected. French philosopher Michel Foucault's work on disciplinary power becomes extremely relevant here. Foucault argued that modern systems of power function not simply through force, but through self surveillance. People internalize expectations, monitor themselves, correct themselves, discipline themselves. And honestly, What is routine body hair removal if not bodily self surveillance? Women checking stubble, bikini lines, underarms, missed hairs, maintenance. Not because someone is physically forcing them to, but because the standard has already been psychologically internalized. That's what makes beauty culture so effective. The policing starts happening from inside the mind, and corporations profit from that endlessly. One of the biggest shifts in the history of pubic hair politics happens when the body stops being private. And honestly, this is where things start getting psychologically claustrophobic, because for most of history, pubic hair was not constantly visible. Then suddenly, bikinis get smaller, pornography becomes mainstream, internet culture explodes, HD cameras arrive, social media intensifies bodily scrutiny, and the most intimate parts of women's bodies become aestheticized. Pubic hair is no longer simply part of the body, it becomes something women are expected to manage visually. If you look at pornography and erotic photography from the 60s and 70s, visible pubic hair was incredibly common. And then something changes. By the 90s and early 2000s, complete hairlessness becomes increasingly normalized. The Brazilian wax explodes in popularity. Celebrity culture amplifies it. Shows like Sex and the City openly discuss it. Magazines frame it as sophisticated, modern, sexy, and expected. And once again, something optional slowly becomes treated like maintenance, like obligation. Media scholar Fiona Atwood has written extensively about the increasing aesthetization and surveillance of intimate bodies under modern media culture. And honestly, you can feel it. Women are now expected to aesthetically manage pubic hair, bikini lines, vulvas, skin texture, discoloration, odor, symmetry, cleanliness. Even genitals become beauty projects. This is also where the rise of cosmetic gynecology and labiaplasty becomes incredibly relevant. Because once pornography and media establish an aesthetic ideal, women begin comparing themselves against it. And what's disturbing is how quickly this happened. Within one generation, women went from pubic hair exists to complete hairlessness is normal femininity. This is an enormous cultural transformation. And pornography played a massive role because pornography does not merely reflect beauty standards, it shapes them. Especially for younger generations, learning what bodies are supposedly supposed to look like. And over time, hairlessness becomes associated with desirability, sexual availability, cleanliness, youthfulness, modern femininity. Which raises a deeply uncomfortable question. Why does patriarchy increasingly reward women for removing visible signs of physical adulthood from the body? Because pubic hair is not random. It is literally one of the biological markers of sexual maturity. So, why did its disappearance become idealized? That question leads somewhere much darker. There's a reason conversations about body hair become emotionally explosive. Because underneath the grooming debate is a much bigger cultural issue: patriarchy's obsession with youth in women. Hairlessness, thinness, smooth skin, softness, girlhood, perpetual youth. Over and over again, patriarchal beauty standards reward women for appearing increasingly young, and critics have been questioning this for decades. Not because every individual preference is consciously predatory, that's not the argument. Human attraction is shaped by culture, conditioning, media, pornography, beauty standards, social reinforcement. But the standard itself still deserves interrogation. Because once you step back and look at the visual logic of many patriarchal beauty ideals, a pattern starts emerging. Women are rewarded for removing body hair, erasing wrinkles, maintaining smooth skin, remaining thin, looking fresh, appearing youthful indefinitely. In other words, visible signs of physical adulthood increasingly become treated like flaws. And that should make us uncomfortable, especially because pubic hair is not simply hair. It's a secondary sex characteristic. It appears during puberty. It visually signals adulthood. So, what does it mean that patriarchy increasingly rewards women for removing visible signs of adulthood from the body? Scholar Rosalind Gill has written extensively about post feminist beauty culture and the increasing pressure for women to self monitor and maintain youthful, sexually desirable bodies. And honestly, you can see this obsession everywhere. Barely legal pornography categories, the fetishization of teen aesthetics, the marketing of girlhood, the obsession with anti aging, the romanticization of women looking tiny, hairless, wrinkle free, and perpetually young. And none of this exists in isolation. Hairlessness becomes part of a larger visual system, a system where ideal femininity under patriarchy is increasingly controlled, sanitized, softened, minimized, disciplined, less visibly adult. And what's fascinating is how normalized this becomes. Women are often taught to view these standards as self care, as confidence, as personal choice. But personal choices do not emerge inside a vacuum. They emerge inside systems, and those systems shape what people learn to find beautiful. Now let's talk about the part beauty culture constantly tries to erase. Body hair politics are not experienced equally because ideas about femininity, cleanliness, refinement, and desirability have always been racialized. This is where the work of sociologist Sabrina Strings becomes incredibly important. In Fearing the Black Body, Strings traces how beauty standards become entangled with colonialism, anti blackness, race science, and European ideas of refinement. And while her work focuses heavily on fat phobia and thinness, the same logic absolutely applies to body hair. Because patriarchal beauty standards did not simply elevate whiteness through skin tone, facial features, hair texture, body size. They also elevated a particular version of femininity, a femininity associated with delicacy, softness, refinement, smoothness, bodily control, civilized presentation. Meanwhile, darker, thicker, or coarser body hair was often racialized differently. Women from Mediterranean backgrounds, Middle Eastern backgrounds, South Asian backgrounds, Latina backgrounds, Black communities have often experienced harsher beauty policing around body hair. Because body hair was not treated neutrally, it became tied to ideas about excess, primitiveness, lack of refinement, uncontrolled femininity. And honestly, you can still see traces of this today. Women with darker body hair are often pressured into more intensive hair removal earlier in life. Many girls from racialized backgrounds describe becoming hyper aware of body hair during puberty because they are socially punished for visible hair more aggressively than white peers. And this is where hygiene language becomes extremely revealing. Because when beauty culture calls hairlessness clean, we need to ask, clean according to whom? Whose bodies were historically framed as naturally refined? Whose bodies were framed as excessive, too hairy, too ethnic, too uncontrolled? Those ideas did not emerge in a vacuum. They emerged from colonial beauty hierarchies. And once you understand that, female body hair stops looking like a simple grooming issue. It becomes part of a much larger system involving race, class, desirability, colonialism, patriarchy, capitalism. The body is never just a body under systems of power. It becomes a social symbol. At this point, we need to ask what might be the most important question in the entire episode. If body hair is inherently disgusting, why is disgust almost entirely gendered? Because male body hair is not generally treated with the same social horror. Hairy chests are sexualized, beards are trendy, male body hair is described as masculine, rugged, mature, natural. Meanwhile, female body hair is often framed as dirty, lazy, unhygienic, embarrassing, letting yourself go. That contradiction tells us something incredibly important. This was never simply about hair. Because if body hair itself were objectively disgusting, society would react to male body hair the same way. But it doesn't, which means disgust itself may be socially conditioned. And honestly, this idea makes people deeply uncomfortable. Because most people experience their beauty standards as instinct, not conditioning, but social disgust is learned. Psychologists and sociologists have long studied the way cultures train emotional reactions. People are not born believing female underarm hair is shameful. They are taught through advertising, movies, pornography, peer pressure, beauty culture, social punishment, desirability politics. And once these ideas become normalized, they stop feeling ideological. They start feeling obvious, natural, common sense. That is what makes beauty standards so powerful. They disappear into the culture. Foucault's ideas around self surveillance become incredibly relevant again here, because women begin monitoring themselves constantly, checking for stubble, maintenance, visible growth, social acceptability. Not necessarily because someone else is watching, but because the gaze has already been internalized. The surveillance moves inside the body. And once that happens, women begin policing themselves, which is one of the most effective forms of social control patriarchy has ever invented. That's probably why this conversation provokes such strong reactions, because once people realize disgust may be socially trained rather than biologically inevitable, the entire system starts looking less natural and much more political. So maybe the point is not whether individual women shave. That was never really the point. The point is understanding why so many of us were taught to see a natural marker of adulthood on the female body as embarrassing, dirty, unfeminine, or unacceptable in the first place. Because once beauty standards become internalized, they stop feeling like standards, and they start feeling like common sense. And maybe that's one of the patriarchy's greatest victories, convincing women that endlessly disciplining their bodies was simply normal femininity. Hairless, controlled, managed, monitored. Not because women naturally hated body hair, but because generations of advertising, media, pornography, capitalism, racial hierarchy, and patriarchal conditioning taught them to. And once you start seeing that system clearly, you'll begin noticing it everywhere. In anti-aging culture, in dieting, in beauty labor, in clean girl aesthetics, in self-surveillance, in the endless pressure for women to remain youthful, smooth, disciplined, and aesthetically acceptable at all times. So the next time someone says, "It's just a preference," maybe pause and ask, where do preferences come from? Who shapes them? Who profits from them? And why are women so often taught that adulthood itself must be softened, minimized, hidden, or erased? Because this conversation was never just about pubic hair. It was about power. So I have a question for you, friends. If femininity under patriarchy requires women to remain hairless, youthful, controlled, and endlessly maintained, what exactly are women being disciplined into becoming? That's it for today's episode, my loves. I do hope you enjoyed it and that it gave you something to think about. If you did, share it with your friends, your family, your coworkers, your group chat. Until next time, my love buckets, take care of yourselves and each other, and remember to stay curious always. Bye!
Make it clap, clap, clap. Make it clap, clap, clap. Make it clap, clap, clap. Make it clap, clap. Make it clap, clap.